The code blue alarm was a harsh, synthetic blare that cut through the sterile quiet of the fourth-floor administrative wing. It was a specific frequency designed by audio engineers to instantly spike human cortisol, a digital scream that demanded immediate motion from anyone within earshot. I kept my pace entirely even. My hard plastic ID badge didn't swing against my chest. My shoulders didn't lift. The chaos of a level 1 trauma center could be deafening, my footsteps wouldn't be. I didn't rush blindly into emergencies. I managed the heavy geometry of the disaster from the top down. I pushed through the heavy, reinforced double doors into the emergency department. The sudden, dense scent of industrial, antiseptic, and sharp ozone hit the back of my throat like a physical weight. A multiple vehicle incident on Interstate 80 had just unloaded a massive, critical surge into our primary intake bay. The room was a shifting, chaotic knot of shouting EMTs in high-visibility jackets, rolling metal stretchers, and the frantic, high-pitched mechanical whine of portable ventilators fighting to stabilize failing vitals. In the absolute center of the organized collapse stood a single nurse. She was systematically directing the incoming stretchers into separate bays with sharp, decisive physical gestures, cutting through the panic with pure logistical authority. She didn't yell over the deafening ambient noise. She simply pointed a rigid index finger at an incoming gurney, then aimed it sharply at Bay 3. And the paramedics obeyed the trajectory without a single second of hesitation. She anticipated a failing vitals monitor before the digital alarm even sounded, ordering a stabilization protocol without breaking her visual scan of the crowded room. I watched her lock a heavy steel brake on a rolling crash cart with the heel of her boot, securing the perimeter around a patient. This was Eliana Baker. She was the most efficient triage coordinator in the state, and a thick, heavily tabbed manila folder currently sat squarely on the center of my desk upstairs, her name printed in stark block letters on the tab. I'd signed far too many of those disciplinary folders this quarter. I stepped into the fray. I didn't practice medicine. My job was maintaining the massive, invisible structure that allowed the medicine to happen safely. A biohazard bin had tipped near Bay 4 during a rapid patient transfer, spilling non-critical plastic packaging and sterile wrappers across the main egress path. I didn't waste valuable radio time calling environmental services for a minor hazard. I righted the heavy plastic bin, kicked the spill back inside with my heavy boots, and secured the latching lid, clearing the tripping vector in under 10 seconds. A second-year resident froze near the central concrete pillar, holding a plastic tray of mismatched supply bags, completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of shouting and motion. I intercepted him, grabbed the tray from his shaking hands, and pointed him firmly toward the rear supply closet. "Bring universal donor supply and 6 heavy Curlix rolls," I ordered, dropping my voice into a low, flat, unyielding command. "Move." He unspooled from his panic instantly, given a clear, singular task, and sprinted down the hall. I walked to the central desk, grabbed a towering stack of blank intake boards, and began aggressively distributing them to the charting nurses pinned along the perimeter. The action was purely logistical, a rapid physical removal of a data bottleneck that was slowing down the patient intake sequence. Eliana caught my movement through the dense crowd. She didn't offer a polite greeting or a deferential nod to my executive title. She held my gaze for a fraction of a second, a silent, demanding expectation of competence, and pointed toward a tall, heavy IV stand positioned near a procedure line in Bay 2. "The locking pin is sheared," she stated, her voice carrying cleanly under the rhythmic, terrifying noise of a failing monitor. "The primary bracket is giving way. It's going to collapse directly onto the procedure line." I stepped quickly to the stand. The aluminum collar was visibly cracked under the swinging, unbalanced weight of 3 heavy fluid bags. I braced my knee hard against the weighted iron base to anchor it, gripped the thick metal pole with both hands, and used my entire upper body weight to physically force the secondary friction lock downward into the emergency groove. It seated with a sharp, heavy metallic clack. I pulled down hard on the crossbar, testing the mechanical resistance. It held solid. "It's stable," I said, stepping back immediately to clear her working space. Before she could reply, the pneumatic tube station mounted on the far wall flashed a rapid, angry red error code. A lab technician was frantically hitting the plastic reset button with the palm of his hand. Critical lab results required for an emergency procedure were stuck in the primary delivery chute, physically jammed somewhere between the second and first floors. I didn't reach for a screwdriver to play mechanic. I keyed the heavy municipal radio clipped to my belt. "Facilities, this is the director." Tube Station 3 is locked on an active override code. Bring the master key and the extraction snake to the ER now. While the technicians ran from the basement, I physically cleared the corridor, unlocking the brakes on a line of empty, discarded gurneys and shoving them against the far wall so the maintenance crew had an unobstructed path the second they arrived. Eliana saw the rapid deployment from Bay 2. She offered a single, tight nod of professional acknowledgement, her eyes already moving past me to the next incoming stretcher rolling through the automatic doors. We worked the line for 3 brutal, relentless hours. I didn't touch a single patient, but I directed the flow of incoming surgical supplies, radioed the house supervisor to immediately open 6 overflow beds on the 3rd floor, and physically cleared the corridors of discarded packaging. The ER was a massive, complex machine running at maximum RPM, and I was keeping the heavy gears greased so it wouldn't tear itself apart. By 2 in the morning, the last critical collision victim was fully stabilized and moving up the freight elevator to the surgical suites. The intake bay finally went quiet, smelling heavily of evaporated bleach, ozone, and profound human exhaustion. I found Eliana standing alone at the central charting station. She was leaning heavily against the high laminate counter, rubbing the back of her neck with a hand that trembled slightly from the massive adrenaline crash. "The stand held," she said, not looking up from the glowing digital tablet resting on the counter. "Friction locks are mathematically reliable," I replied, leaning against the adjacent wall. I kept a deliberate, professional, 3 feet of distance between us. "But your administrative file isn't." She finally looked up, her dark eyes narrowing instantly. "Excuse me? You missed a mandatory dual signature on a controlled medication form 3 days ago?" I stated, dropping the heavy facts into the quiet space. "And yesterday afternoon, you entirely bypassed the primary intake protocol to fast-track a time-critical pediatric intake. The patient's vitals were dropping in the hallway," she fired back, her voice dropping into a dangerous, fiercely defensive register. She pushed off the counter, squaring her tired shoulders. "I bypassed the required paperwork to stabilize the immediate decline, and the dispersal form was a basic clerical error during a mandated double shift. I signed it 10 minutes later when the cart was finally restocked." "I know," I said, my tone remaining entirely flat, devoid of accusation. "I read the pharmacy counts. The patient stabilized perfectly, and the inventory was mathematically balanced. Your actions were medically flawless." She crossed her arms, the fabric of her scrubs pulling tight across her shoulders. "Then, what exactly is the problem, Director?" "The problem," I said, stepping slightly closer so my voice wouldn't carry down the empty, echoing hall, "is Dr. Aris. He is leading the new state compliance audit for this quarter. He intentionally flagged both of those incidents. He is building a documented, paper trail pattern of insubordination. He's actively pushing for a 90-day license suspension." The remaining color drained completely from her face. An administrative threat was infinitely more dangerous to her than a physical emergency. A crashing patient was a solvable, tactile puzzle. A bureaucratic review board could end her entire career in 10 minutes with a single, indifferent stamp. "I don't have a defense against a targeted administrative audit," she said quietly, her hands dropping heavily to her sides. "If Aris wants the paper trail to look negligent, he'll isolate the timestamps and strip the context. It's his word and his audit authority against my memory of the shift." "He's looking at the paper," I countered, keeping my voice steady. "I look at the structural integrity of the entire system." I reached inside the inner pocket of my jacket, pulled out a tightly folded sheet of official hospital letterhead, and slid it smoothly across the surface of the charting station. "This is a temporary departmental transfer order," I stated. "As of 0200 hours, you are officially reassigned to the director's office under the title of Clinical Logistics Consultant. The transfer legally removes you from the ER roster, which completely bypasses the jurisdiction of his departmental audit." She stared down at the heavy paper, reading my authorized signature at the bottom. "You're pulling me off the floor. I'm pulling you out of his direct line of fire before he pulls the trigger," I corrected her. "You report to my office at 8 a.m. Sharp. We're going to audit the auditor." She didn't argue. She recognized a necessary tactical retreat when she saw the math. She picked up the heavy paper, folded it sharply along the crease, and walked toward the staff locker room without another word. I watched her go, my jaw tight. The hospital was my structural domain. I didn't let ambitious bureaucrats dismantle my best people for the sake of a quarterly quota. The next morning, the fourth-floor administrative wing was bathed in harsh, unforgiving fluorescent sunlight. My office was a testament to absolute utility. A heavy steel desk, two ergonomic chairs, and three walls lined entirely with massive whiteboards tracking supply chains, equipment maintenance schedules, and staffing algorithms. Eliana arrived at exactly 8 a.m. She wore dark, tailored slacks and a crisp white button-down shirt, her posture rigid and defensive. She looked entirely out of place away from the chaos of the ER, but she carried the same intense focus. "Sit," I instructed, pointing a heavy metal pen toward the chair opposite my desk. I reached down to the floor, heaved a massive stack of heavily bound, printed reports, and dropped them onto the center of the steel desk. The sound was a loud, definitive thud that echoed off the whiteboards. "This is the aggregate data for the last 6 months of Dr. Aris's departmental audits," I said, tapping the thick binder with my knuckles. "He's methodical, but he's lazy. He targets high-volume staff members because the sheer numerical volume of their daily interactions mathematically guarantees a minor clerical error he can weaponize." Ileana leaned forward, her eyes tracking the endless columns of data on the top page. "So, how do we break his established pattern?" "We don't break it," I said, pulling open the heavy binder. "We map the structural flaws in his methodology. We are going to cross-reference every single flag he's filed against the hospital's central server timestamps. If he is targeting you specifically, the raw data will show a statistical deviation." For the first hour, the heavy silence in the office was absolute. We pulled digital data from my terminal, manually matched keystroke timestamps against printed shift logs, and began building an aggressive, chronological timeline on the main whiteboard. Then, a high-priority system alert pinged quietly on my secondary monitor. I stopped writing. Eliana looked over. Aris's access ID flashed green on the screen. He was actively archiving the previous quarter's IT logs, trying to bury the digital paper trail before the review board convened. I didn't panic. I didn't rush. I simply opened the master administrative console, executed a hard, system-level lock on his specific directory, freezing him out of the mainframe entirely, and went right back to my spreadsheet. Ileana watched the screen lock, a small, impressed exhale escaping her. "That's going to make him angry." "Let him be angry," I said. "He can't delete what he can't touch." By 10:30 a.m., the spreadsheet hit a sudden, frustrating dead end. The pharmacy timestamps simply didn't align for the second quarter. The spreadsheets blurred together, a relentless wall of digital numbers that refused to yield a pattern. The structural logic of my defense was failing. I gripped the edge of the steel desk, staring at the monitor, my jaw locked. The desk felt like an anvil under my palms. Eliana stood up, walked around the desk, and leaned over my shoulder. "He's hiding the latency behind a secondary coding mask," she said, her clinical knowledge slicing through my logistical roadblock. "Look right here." He recategorized the entire dispersal code block. He shifted them from active, critical, to routine maintenance in the local system architecture. I looked closely at the specific column she indicated. "That legally alters the required response time window in the algorithm." "Exactly," she confirmed, stepping back to the whiteboard and picking up a red marker. He moved the digital goalpost so the system lag wouldn't trigger an automatic IT review, but it would still generate a late flag for the nursing staff on the floor. It's a deliberate manipulation of the sorting protocol. She had found the structural crack I had missed. She wasn't just a passenger in this defense. She was actively building the reinforced walls alongside me. I deleted the original query, input her adjusted parameters into the search field, and ran the extraction again. The data aligned perfectly. The weapon was sharp. Before we continued, a high-pitched, metallic rattling sound started echoing from the ceiling HVAC register directly above the desk. The vibration was relentless, a high-frequency drilling noise that shattered the focus in the quiet room. I pushed my chair back, grabbed the heavy aluminum step stool from the corner, and climbed up. I pulled my multi-tool from my belt and tightened the loose louver screws on the vent cover. A fine dusting of plaster fell onto the shoulder of my dark shirt. The rattle persisted, the internal fan vibrating against the housing. I gripped the thin aluminum flange and physically bent the metal a quarter-inch downward to permanently change the aerodynamic flow of the forced air. The rattling stopped instantly. Absolute, heavy silence flooded back into the office. I stepped down, collapsed the stool, and pushed it back against the wall. Eliana pushed a cold bottle of water across the steel desk toward me. "You treat this entire administrative building like a massive, vibrating engine block?" she noted, watching me put the multi-tool away. A faint, dry amusement touched the corner of her mouth, momentarily breaking her defensive armor. An engine needs constant tuning, I replied, taking the water and unscrewing the cap. Otherwise, the friction tears it apart. Next time, she said softly, picking up her red marker again, just call maintenance. The ER is loud enough without you fighting the air vents up here. At exactly noon, I walked over to the small utility table in the corner. I poured 2 cups of black coffee from the carafe and pulled a foil-wrapped protein bar from my personal stash in the drawer. I walked back and set the coffee and the food down near her right hand. I didn't say anything. I just placed the heavy ceramic mug within her reach. I had memorized her order weeks ago during a mass casualty drill. Black, no sugar, scorchingly hot. She paused her rapid writing on the whiteboard. She looked at the foil wrapper, then at the steam rising from the dark liquid. She put her marker down, picked up the mug, and wrapped both hands firmly around the warmth. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet in the large room. Eat the ration, I said, picking up my own mug. We have exactly 2.5 hours before Eris arrives for the preliminary briefing. Your brain needs the glucose to process the final server lag numbers. By 2:30 p.m., the massive whiteboard was completely covered in a dense, interconnected web of black and red marker lines. It wasn't just a defensive argument anymore. It was a forged, lethal weapon. Look at this cluster right here, Eliana said, standing up and tapping her pen aggressively against a specific set of dates. Every single time he flagged me for a procedural delay over the last 90 days, the central server shows a corresponding system lag in the software. The delay wasn't human error. It was entirely mechanical. I stood up, stepping close to the board. I looked at the raw numbers, verifying the absolute correlation. She was right. The system infrastructure was broken, not the nurse. He ignored the software latency logs, I stated, my voice cold with professional disgust. He built a termination narrative on fundamentally incomplete data. Before we could finalize the timeline into a printable brief, the heavy oak door of my office swung open without a knock. Dr. Eris stepped in. He was a tall, thin man in a pristine gray suit, carrying a sleek digital tablet and a thick manila envelope. His assistant hovered nervously behind him in the hallway. He looked at the heavily marked whiteboard, his eyes narrowing slightly, then at Eliana. His expression tightened into a deeply patronizing frown. Director Rodriguez, Eris said smoothly, stepping fully into the room. I wasn't aware Nurse Baker was transferring to administration. It seems highly irregular, given her pending disciplinary review. In fact, I have the formal suspension paperwork drafted right here. He tapped the envelope against his leg. Her transfer was executed under my direct executive authority, Eris, I said, stepping smoothly between him and Eliana. I didn't raise my voice. I just dropped the absolute weight of my title into the room like a concrete block, physically cutting off his line of sight to her. She is currently assisting me in a comprehensive review of hospital data protocols. Eris bristled, his grip tightening on his tablet. Be that as it may, I have the preliminary findings of her audit. The pattern of negligence is undeniably clear. I am recommending an immediate, unpaid 90-day suspension. He expected me to argue protocol. He expected a polite, bureaucratic negotiation where we compromised on a 30-day suspension to save face. I didn't negotiate. I turned to the steel desk, picked up a thick, heavily tabbed file folder we had just spent 5 hours building, and slammed it down directly onto the desk in front of him. The sound made him physically flinch. The assistant in the hallway stopped breathing. This is a cross-referenced aggregate of the last 90 days of your specific departmental audits, I stated, delivering the facts like physical blows. It details 47 separate instances where you cited clinical staff for procedural delays without ever cross-referencing the server logs. The main server was experiencing documented latency drops of up to 4 minutes. Nurse Baker specifically identified your unauthorized recategorization of the dispersal codes to hide the lag. I took a slow, heavy step closer to him, forcing him to look up at me. You didn't find human negligence, Eris. You found a software glitch, and you willfully weaponized a mechanical failure against my clinical staff to justify your quarterly audit quotas. Eris stared down at the thick file. The arrogant color drained rapidly from his face. This is an internal IT systems issue. It doesn't excuse her willfully bypassing the intake protocol yesterday afternoon. The intake bypass was officially executed under the imminent life threat clause of the state medical code. Section 4A. I countered instantly. I personally verified the patient's vitals upon admission. The bypass was entirely legally sound. I pointed a rigid finger at the suspension envelope in his hand. If you proceed with that suspension paperwork, I will personally file this aggregate data report directly with the State Medical Board, detailing your deliberate falsification of audit metrics, and I will recommend a permanent revocation of your oversight credentials. The office was dead silent. The low, mechanical hum of the overhead HVAC unit was the only sound in the room. Eris looked at the damning file. He looked at the absolute, cold certainty in my face. He saw absolutely zero room for compromise or negotiation. The structural defense was impenetrable. The review board is canceled, Eris said tightly. He didn't attempt to pick up my file. He shoved his suspension envelope under his arm, turned abruptly on his heel, and walked rapidly out of the office, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. The heavy brass latch clicked securely into place. The threat was entirely neutralized. I didn't celebrate. I walked slowly back to the desk, picked up my mug of black coffee, and took a slow drink. The massive surge of adrenaline was fading from my bloodstream, leaving a cold, familiar, hollow space in the center of my chest. Eliana stood near the whiteboard. She let out a long, shaky breath, dropping her marker onto the aluminum tray. The audit is permanently closed, I confirmed, setting the mug down. Your license is entirely secure. The IT department is fixing the server latency this afternoon. She looked at me. The rigid, intensely defensive posture she had carried since I pulled her out of the ER had completely vanished. She looked physically exhausted, but entirely present and grounded. You built a trap. I built a structural defense. I corrected mildly. He relied on lazy, fragmented data. Well, we used heavy facts. She took a slow, deliberate step toward me. The proximity shifted the air in the quiet office. I felt the sudden heat of her presence, a stark contrast to the sterile, isolated environment of my daily life. My hand tightened into a fist inside my pocket, the thick canvas scraping my knuckles. I shifted my stance backward, bracing my boots against the linoleum like I was fighting a physical wind that wasn't there. You didn't have to pull me into this office, she said quietly, looking up at me. You could have just pulled the data yourself and handed me the file. You let me fight him with you. I don't leave my best people exposed to the elements, I said, my voice dropping into a rougher cadence. I took another deliberate, measured step backward, forcing the physical distance between us, maintaining a strict professional boundary. I refused to let my structural authority bleed into a personal advantage. You need to get back to the ER. They're chronically short-staffed on the swing shift. She stopped. She noticed the immediate retreat. She looked at the physical space between us, then up at my face. She saw the rigid control, the absolute effort it took for me to maintain the physical distance. A quiet, profound understanding flashed in her eyes. She recognized the boundary for what it was: protection, not rejection. Right, she said, her voice softening into something undeniably warm. The ER. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She didn't push against the boundary. She walked to the door, pausing with her hand resting on the heavy brass handle. I'll see you on the floor, Director. I'll be there, I replied steadily. The door clicked shut. I stood alone in the massive, quiet office, surrounded by the heavy data, the complex algorithms, and the sterile whiteboards. The hospital was safe. The structural integrity of the staff was secure, but the void in the room felt heavier than ever. 3 days passed. The massive hospital returned to its brutal, predictable cadence. I worked a punishing 72-hour rotation, managing unexpected supply chain failures and navigating severe budget shortfalls in radiology. On Tuesday night, the central heating manifold in the old pediatric wing failed completely. A heavy industrial gasket had blown in the sub-basement. Facilities estimated 4 hours for a safe repair. Ambient temperatures in the high-dependency unit were actively dropping to unsafe levels. I stood in the humid mechanical room, looking at the broken equipment. Normally, protocol dictated I initiate a massive, resource-draining full ward transfer to the East Wing. It was the safe, bureaucratic move. But I keyed my radio and contacted Ileana in the ER. Baker, pediatric ward temperatures are dropping. Do we have the thermal margin for a massive patient transfer? No. Her voice came back instantly, sharp and clear over the static. The transport time will expose them to a larger temperature delta. Isolate the ward and bring external heat. I'll send 2 techs with heavy thermal blankets right now. I didn't order the transfer. I radioed facilities. Have licensed electricians stage emergency portable generators at the loading dock. I'm signing the emergency override to tie them directly into the pediatric grid. Move. While they staged the power, I physically cleared the service corridors, moving heavy linen carts out of the way so the facilities team could run the thick 220-volt industrial extension cables straight up the stairwell without delay. The licensed electricians handled the live tie-in efficiently. We bypassed the internal grid entirely and stabilized the ambient environment before the next hourly temp check cycle. The structure held. Her operational logic had permanently altered my own. On Thursday afternoon, the phone on my desk chimed loudly. It was Marcus, the head of security. "Director," Marcus said, his voice completely flat. "I need you down in the main ground floor lobby. We have a logistical issue." I hung up the receiver, grabbed my hard plastic ID badge, and took the concrete stairs rapidly down to the ground floor. The main lobby was a massive, high-ceilinged atrium, usually chaotic with anxious visitors and discharging patients. Today, it was strangely quiet. The late afternoon sun filtered through the massive, reinforced glass skylights, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished floorboards. The shift change was happening, meaning dozens of staff were moving through the space. I spotted Marcus standing near the main polished stone reception desk. Next to him was Eliana. She wasn't wearing her blue scrubs. She wore dark jeans and a heavy, textured wool sweater. She held a thick, formal document folder in one hand and a white cardboard cup of coffee in the other. She stepped forward and placed the cup directly on the edge of the reception desk next to me. Black, no sugar, scorchingly hot. The exact same placement she'd used in my office. I walked over, my heavy boots echoing sharply on the polished tile. "What's the issue, Marcus?" Marcus didn't answer. He just offered a tight, knowing grin, tapped his radio, and stepped back toward the glass doors, giving us space. Eliana turned to face me. She didn't look defensive. She looked completely anchored, entirely in her element. "There's no logistical issue," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the large space. Several nurses and administrative staff working behind the reception desk paused to watch us. "I needed you out of your office." I crossed my arms over my chest. "Why?" She held out the thick folder. "This is a formal, drafted proposal for a new triage logistics protocol. I spent the last 3 days writing it based on the data we mapped. It legally streamlines the trauma intake process and permanently hard-codes the emergency bypass directly into the primary server software. No more latency flags, no more lazy audits." She wasn't asking for a favor. She was taking the tactical defense we had built in my office and turning it into permanent, institutional armor for the entire clinical staff. "I need the director's authorized signature to implement it," she continued, taking a deliberate step closer. She didn't drop her gaze. She made sure her voice carried to the staff standing nearby. "And for the record, if anyone in this hospital asks who I trust in a crisis, I'm saying your name first. I expect you to co-chair the implementation committee with me." I looked at the folder. It was heavy, highly practical, and entirely necessary. It was a shared project. I looked past the paper, into her eyes. She was making a highly public, entirely professional demand for my time and my presence. She was actively, undeniably choosing to stand beside me. "I don't co-chair operational committees without reading the exact terms," I said, my voice low and steady. "Then read them," she replied, holding the folder steady between us. I uncrossed my arms and took the heavy folder from her hands. The transfer of weight was solid, grounding. I opened the dark cover, verifying the executive summary page. The logistical structure was flawless. I pulled a heavy steel pen from my inside pocket. I didn't hesitate. I signed my name aggressively on the solid black line at the bottom of the page. "The protocol is approved," I stated, handing the heavy folder back to her. She took it, her fingers briefly, deliberately brushing against the back of my knuckles. The physical contact was brief, completely professional for the setting, but it carried the absolute weight of a heavy steel door finally locking securely into place. "Good," Eliana said, a small, genuine smile completely breaking across her face, lighting up her eyes. "Committee meetings start tomorrow morning at 0800. Don't be late." "I'm never late," I replied. She nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the heavy doors of the ER, the thick folder tucked securely under her arm. I stood in the massive lobby, the chaotic, ambient noise of the hospital finally swirling back to life around me. For the first time in 6 years, the heavy, crushing weight of the institution didn't feel like an isolating burden. It felt like a foundation. The end. Closing thoughts. He didn't promise her a dramatic rescue or a perfect life. He signed the protocol, fixed the system, and posted the committee schedule. At 7:59 the next morning, his badge was already swiped at the door. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.